Trump is once again saying that Putin wants peace. Why does the US president remain so loyal to Putin even though Moscow has shown zero real results in these talks? And what should Ukraine be ready for given this kind of rhetoric from the American side? We'll discuss all this with Andriy Dobriansky, Director of Communications and Media at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Mr. Dobriansky, nice to see you.
Thank you for having me back on.
So, despite reports in Western media that the talks have failed, Trump is still sure that Putin wants peace. In your opinion, why is the US president so confident?
Two things. One, I don't believe he's expressing confidence. He's expressing bravado and false confidence, often repeating things that he believes people will believe. We hear this all the time when he cites the thousands of people that have been killed. He is not receiving information every day about how many people have died. And that's why he always says that both Russians and Ukrainians have died, and not focusing on the fact that it's civilians who have died in Ukraine, those who have been invaded. And frankly, the people who are dying on the Russian side are invaders, and therefore they have forfeited their right. So it's a problem that has been ongoing since the beginning of this conflict, and his understanding of it, I think it primarily lies with the people that he surrounds himself with, the majority of which like to speak about Ukraine but have not visited Ukraine. And that's the key difference.
What do you think Putin could offer Trump that makes Trump keep sending delegations to Moscow even though they never bring back any real results?
Frankly, private business deals. This is what Witkoff has been interested from the very beginning. We, of course, read in the Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago how many potential business deals there are for Witkoff and the Trump family that have been potentially brought to their attention. This is very interesting that Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, was involved in this latest meeting. He has often been described in the media as somebody who, especially in the first administration, because he's not a part of this administration, but he was an advisor this time. But in the first administration, oftentimes when he was meeting with foreign leaders, he would have discussions while on official business about getting help from these leaders in the Middle East, especially with his private business dealings in their countries. We can only assume that when he's visiting a country and he doesn't have an official government capacity, that he is want to do the same thing again. So it's not so much that the United States would benefit from any trade with Russia, but that the personal wealth of President Trump and his acolytes, and we already know that he has increased his personal wealth by several billions since the beginning of this year. That is the real benefit to work with Russia, not so much for the United States.
Did you personally have any expectations from this visit of Kushner and Witkoff?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that we had two people visit. We've had numerous visits by Witkoff to Russia already. Again, not following up on his promise to Ukraine to visit Ukraine this year. But the important thing is that all those visits happen on a solo basis. So it was Mr. Witkoff arriving by himself without an interpreter, who we very much know about that. But this time we have another person. And why this is interesting is that several times throughout this process, it has come back to the White House that what Steve Witkoff was saying was not the same thing that the other side was relating. Now, we all know that the Russian side will be lying, but it will be interesting if both Kushner and Witkoff come back to Trump and to see if they are on the same page together or if their version of what was discussed differs.
Trump is being told that Russia could be a good economic partner. But does the US administration really understand that Russia's economy is falling apart and that whatever is still working is fully focused on the war?
Right, and I think that's the main difference. Just in the last week, we've had, obviously, NATO meetings on the European continent where we have had the participation of some undersecretaries from the United States, notably people who, in private, castigated European leaders for focusing on their domestic arms industry in Europe and not buying from the United States. So as you mentioned, the entire economy of Russia has been focused on the war. We know that the expenditures go a lot towards these bonuses for signing up, the incredible amounts of money that it costs to manufacture these weapons or purchase them from China, purchase or fund the North Korean slave labor they have making the Shahed drones. But they are really not making anything, and therefore there would be nothing to add. Even their vaunted space program is now shut down, given the damage at Baikonur. So there's not much that the Russians could offer as a trade partner, unless you were looking at military arms. And not only are the military industry of the United States superior to them, but we already heard earlier this week that the United States is not interested in even other countries that are their allies producing their own arms. They want to be producing weapons in the United States to sell to the rest of the world.
So what kind of economic partnership does Trump see between US and Russia? And is it possible that sanctions could be lifted?
Well, the dream, the proposal that has been on the table for at least 15 years is to get United States fossil fuel developers into the Russian coastline. Russia does not currently have the technology to do the hydrofracking, to do the ways of offshore drilling for oil that the United States has. This was something that we all know before the invasion of Ukraine in 2014, that Exxon was signing a deal with Russia to develop this technology, to share this technology with Russia, and that was immediately stopped. So that's one possible entree, is to develop further fuel interests, which has been powering the United States economy. We have been a net exporter of fossil fuels now for over a decade. But also, there is also what Ukraine has already agreed to with the United States, and that's the potential for fossil fuels, not fossil fuels, but rare earth elements. All of these things, both fossil fuel extraction as well as rare earth elements extraction, take over a decade to develop. So nothing would be immediately coming to the United States, in which case Donald Trump would be gone and all of these deal makings would be for naught for the next president.
Trump said that Putin wants to end the war, but that it takes two to tango. That is his favorite expression, and is to suggesting that Ukraine is one that doesn't want peace.
Yeah, I think Ukraine has done a very good job at demonstrating this, and this is something that has been highlighted on American media, that every time that President Trump has asked for a meeting with Ukraine, has asked for Ukraine to sign an agreement, asked Ukraine to do anything, frankly, Ukraine, and this is President Zelensky's administration, has done whatever it can to do so. Notably, I always point out to American diplomat friends that it was not Ukraine that brushed off President Trump's request in Istanbul. Ukraine was there at any level. It was ready to have President Zelensky meet with President Putin in May. Then it would be the foreign minister meeting with the foreign minister of Russia. Finally, it became lower level deputies on the diplomatic side. But that was what President Trump asked, and that is what Ukraine supplied. What we're not seeing is any kind of accession by Russia. So when President Trump asked for a unilateral 30-day ceasefire, Ukraine has had that on the table for 300 days now. That is not what we're getting from Russia. I think that every phone call that President Trump had, Mr. Putin has launched missiles and drones and glide bombs against Ukraine that very night. So it's clearly something that can get to this administration, the amount of disrespect that Russia is showing them. No matter how many meetings Witkoff might have in Russia, he's clearly not getting anything from the Russians. On the other side, Ukraine is very much willing to deal with the United States. Merz
and Macron, in their conversation with Zelensky, shared their concerns about Trump pressuring Ukraine. What exactly might Europe be afraid of when it comes to the United States?
Well, there's obviously lots of conspiracy theories, but I think the main thing that people should be worried about is the inconsistency of the United States. The United States can say one day that it believes that Ukraine can win this war, and not only that, but militarily conquer back all the occupied territories. And then we have a couple of weeks later asking for Ukraine to give up territory. That's a wild shift in position. It reflects the fact that the president himself is not ideologically ideological. He doesn't have any core beliefs, and therefore he is prone to do these wild swings. And the way that the government is currently set up, there are no elder statesmen of government who are involved in the White House administration, the executive branch. Congress, even though they have maybe made statements, has not voted against any of the actions of the president as regards to this conflict, nor have they authorized additional aid at the request of the president. So the problem here is that you have a completely inconsistent leadership of the United States, and nobody within the United States government that is powerful enough to put any brakes on this inconsistency, or at least put some measures on this inconsistency, so that you at least narrow it down to maybe two options, not these wild swings that I just mentioned.
Kushner and Witkoff were supposed to meet Zelensky in Brussels after their trip to Moscow. But the meeting was cancelled, and this is already the third time Witkoff has avoided meeting Zelensky. Does it look like he's trying to hide from Zelensky?
I think Witkoff, his entire position would change as soon as he got onto the ground in Ukraine. Now, you mentioned the potential meeting in Brussels. I don't believe from my Ukrainian press colleagues that was confirmed. So it was something that was offered. And it was a very generous offer by Zelensky to meet with a special advisor. Normally this would be leader to leader, not to special advisor. But in that case, once again, Witkoff and Kushner decided not to. There was also reported that the Russian side, I don't know if it was Putin himself, because he didn't really attend a lot of that meeting. But it was reported that they were asked, Kushner and Witkoff, not to visit Ukraine. And I think that's the more important part. Beyond just meeting in Brussels, they need to step on Ukrainian territory and understand what's happening. I often remark to many of my colleagues here in the United States that part of the reason that Donald Trump won this war is because of domestic issues here in the United States, and one of them being the southern border of America, where Kamala Harris had not visited once in her time in office as vice president. It's very similar to Steve Witkoff talking about Ukraine without ever having stepped foot on Ukrainian territory, visiting the front line, understanding how we have schools that are underground, how Ukraine is looking at building hospitals underground, the fact that over 1 million children now have to study online because of the power outages and school damage to their schools. This is something that you get viscerally, and every single American delegation that I've gone with, and I've done over 12 or 13 since 2022, every single American comes back with a vastly different perspective on what they've read in the news or what they've seen on video, and when you actually see it in real life.
Trump, I'd like to talk next about Trump's political position. Trump had a full year to end the war in 24 hours, as he promised. That didn't happen. How do you think? Will American voters ask him about this during the upcoming elections, and could this affect the Republicans' chances?
I don't know about how it'll affect the election directly. It will be an issue because we know that it'll be an issue because Donald Trump is still focused on it. Recently, over the last 24 hours, he closed down the United States Institute of Peace, a very noble institution founded by Republicans, no less. But it was really this morning. It's apparently being reopened and rechristened as the Donald Trump Institute of Peace. He is very interested in his legacy. He's very interested in being nominated and achieving a Nobel Peace Prize. Obviously, he has not attained these results, and it is notable that the one conflict he spoke about over 50 times, he mentioned during his campaign that he could solve this in one day. And it's very noticeable that that is a promise to the world and especially to American voters that he has not kept, which is why he is always open to these ideas, either from Vice President Vance, Steve Witkoff, Marco Rubio, whoever proposes to him that there is an idea to solve this war, he will let them try this out. And obviously this time Steve Witkoff failed, J.D. Vance failed, just as he has numerous times in promoting these ideas. And that's because we're working with an enemy who doesn't want to achieve peace. And that's something that was missing in the rhetoric. In the rhetoric before the election, President Trump was not saying and he keeps saying, as you mentioned earlier, that President Putin wants to have peace. President Putin does not want to have peace, as he just talked about in his many public speeches over the last month. He wants to keep the war going in Ukraine. They will escalate the war in Ukraine, and they will fight until the last Ukrainian is dead. That is Russia's position, and it should be the United States' position to stand by its military ally.
And is it possible that Trump will step away from the negotiation process?
I don't think he's taking an active participation right now. I think after Alaska, he was incredibly frustrated. He appreciated the time he spent with European allies after that, more so than he did with President Putin. And I think at this point, it is less President Trump who is dictating what's happening. And it is, again, Steve Witkoff. It is anybody in this administration who comes to him with a potential plan. President Trump says, sure, try that. And this time it failed. We will see if any other proposals come. In the meantime, the United States has not allocated any monies for Ukraine. We'll still see if any monies that are being proposed in this year's budget come to pass. But the United States is completely out of the supplying Ukraine business. It is only here to sell arms to Ukraine from European money or Ukrainian money or wherever they find additional funds. It is not coming from the United States budget. So at this point, Donald Trump can relate to his voters that he stopped funding any weapons for Ukraine or any additional help to Ukraine, and in the meantime, he's still having his people work on finishing the war as his campaign promise dictated.
Ukraine's National Security Secretary Rustem Umerov is coming to the U.S. again. And what will be discussing with American officials this time? How do you think?
Again, there are certain aspects that I believe that numerous people on the American side and the Ukrainian side said that they are closer to some aspects of the initial plan. And one of the big differences that began when this Russian capitulation plan was proposed was the fact that a lot of it, as with any proposal by Russia, goes against numerous laws, goes against Ukrainian law, goes against international law, goes against American law. What I believe the negotiation in Miami that took place earlier was that the Ukrainian side was not telling them what was practical, but what can be and what can happen in relation to all these laws. And that meant that 28-point plan was eliminated down to, some people say 14, some people say 19. Maybe it's even 2 or 3 points. But if Ukraine can demonstrate that they can agree to even 2 or 3 points, but hopefully more for the United States, Donald Trump would take that as a victory and demonstrate that he is a great negotiator, even though he's not involved personally in the process. That is something that Ukraine can do to keep Donald Trump interested in working with Ukraine, hopefully once again thinking about supplying longer-range missiles to Ukraine. And in the meantime, Russia is going to keep attacking, keep humiliating Donald Trump, and that only serves to bring the United States closer to Ukraine.
Also, Trump says that the U.S. is no longer financially supporting Ukraine. What should Ukraine prepare for? On your opinion, is it realistic that we could completely lose U.S. support?
Well, the United States, other than the monies appropriated in 2024 by the Biden administration, so those are still weapons that were coming to Ukraine, there are no specific, expenditures. Obviously, there are some military coordination, so you could say that part of the military personnel at European Command who are working with the Ukrainians as far as targeting information or intelligence information. But that's really under the auspices of European Command, and that's a regular budget expenditure. So no real budgetary expenditures have been allotted for aiding Ukraine, and that's been since the middle of the summer, since the Pearl project was announced in July of 2025. And since that time, we have seen the only weapons coming to Ukraine being purchased by outside money, not American expenditures. Now, this is both a detriment and a benefit to Ukraine. One of the reasons is that the United States was using its monies in a very economical way and sending expired munitions or very old munitions to Ukraine. A big change that has happened, especially since the implementation of the Pearl program, is that Ukraine is now receiving newer weapons, especially the ATACMS that they used early in November. Those were newer versions of ATACMS, not the versions from the early 2000s that were initially sent under Joe Biden. So there's pluses and minuses to having Europe purchase as opposed to the United States allocate these. But again, we haven't finished our budget negotiations for fiscal year 2026, which are happening right now. And just this week, we had a hearing about the stolen children of Ukraine. We've had hearings about other cooperation with Ukraine, and all of those require some kind of American budget, either for law enforcement purposes or otherwise. And that's something that I hope to see included in the budget. We have yet to see those budgets being agreed upon. That was one of the reasons that we had a shutdown, because Congress couldn't get to an agreement overall on the budget, not the Ukrainian part. But we'll see if the United States actually adds some money back, if the Congress adds some money back for Ukraine in this budget. I don't know if it's going to be military help, but we can only see.
And before we finish our conversation, I'd like to ask you, what is your vision, your personal vision of how this war could realistically end under the current circumstances? How do you think? What is your opinion?
I think that the change in strategy, or not so much strategy, but what we've seen on the battlefield, which is that Ukraine is taking the fight onto Russian territory finally. The fact that so many, the Russian revenues, oil revenues, have decreased so tremendously. This is the same problem that Genghis Khan had, the same problem that Napoleon had, Alexander the Great. Anytime you are invading, your main problem is your logistics about supplying your military at the front line. And the more Ukraine hits back beyond the front line, the more apt it is for the Russian ability to keep up its military invasion will at some point fall apart. There are not that many successful invasions of foreign territory throughout history, if especially, and what we're seeing here, Russia hasn't marshaled its entire populace to do this. It's still very much a special military operation in their mind. We've talked about the fact that the entire economy has been turned over to support the war, but they are clearly not using every asset that they could, and therefore they have allowed their assets beyond the front line to be targeted. And in this way, I really believe that the end of this war isn't a frozen conflict. It would be a great mistake if Europe were to allow a frozen conflict like we saw in 2015, and then starting up again in 2022. And the only way this happens is if we twofold. If Ukraine is able, with its Western support, to weaken Russia to the fact that its frontline occupation collapses, that they have to pull back because they are not being able to be resupplied. And secondly, we need to make sure that all the war crimes are prosecuted. There's no way that we can have any kind of international agreement that includes amnesty. This includes not just prosecuting people, but also releasing the prisoners that have been taken by Russia, and especially those 20,000 children.
Mr. Dobriansky, I very appreciate you for this conversation, and I would like to ask our viewers to press the button like under this video, and please share your thoughts in the comments, and also tell us where you're watching from. My guest on this stream was Andriy Dobriansky, Director of Communications and Media at the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. Thank you.
Thank you so much.